Good morning, everyone. We want to welcome you to our webinar today. We are talking about planning for your business. I know we all have issues that we're facing in this upcoming year, so we're talking with our business analysis, James Strack, this morning, getting some tips on how to plan for next year. So James, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Abby. I want to say good morning to everyone and thank you for attending. So background information for those of you who do not know me. My name is James Strack. I have 30 years of experience in corporate IT. I started my life designing software for law firms in New York. Spent 12 years designing software in the oil industry, crisscrossing the country, and spent 16 years as a corporate CIO. So what we're going to talk about today is plans and thinking about planning for next year and issues that we should just be putting on the table to start discussing so that we're not at a crunch at the 11th hour. And so we will start. One of the things we want to start talking about are the different challenges that we'll face as we look for the new year. And one of those things is always preparing for an audit. And not everyone will go through audits, but many companies, whether they're public or private, will have audits done every year, and they won't be just financial audits, but they will also be technology audits. So one of the things that I like to do as I get ready for the new year is I take the time to review all my security settings and all my security policies and who has access to what on networks, who has access to physical buildings, who has access to data. So user access is always important. If you get an audit, one of the things that will always be asked of you is, what access does each individual person have to different systems? And part of that is also some checks and balances. Does the person who enters your AP transaction also have the authority to write a check? And someone who is handling your books and doing your accounting work, can they do things like write themselves a check? So they're looking for where there are issues that you may need to have some visibility to. There are SOX compliance, and whether you're private or public, some of these are just standard guidelines. As I mentioned, who has access to what data? Where are the checks and balances in your system? Do you have things flowing properly, and who's touching which piece of information? Is there an area where there's only one person who knows everything, who has all that access to all that data, and where are the checks and balances? I also review a network mapping. Whether you're a small business or large, you have a network in place. Sometimes it might be a small LAN with a small business server. Sometimes it could be a large wide area network or a WAN with multiple buildings, facilities, and just knowing where my IP address is, where are all the things that I need to be concerned about, are they still valid? One of the other things I look at when it comes audit time is whether or not I'm going to do any vulnerability testing. What happens with networks is as they continue to grow, and even small ones, you have a certain amount of risk of being hacked from the outside world. If you have any connectivity to the outside world, there's a chance of being hacked from the outside world. So I like to do some testing to make sure that our network is secure. We have all our patches in, we have all the protocols in place, and that our network is reasonably secure from any potential outside hacking. And there's two kinds of vulnerability testing that I like to have done. One is called a knowledge test, and what happens here is this is where you take an outside firm who's going to do your testing and you give them some basic information about your network. So they actually have more information than the average outsider would, and that gives them an edge on getting into your network. And if that will prevent them from getting in, it shows you do have the right security in place, you do have the right validations and protocols in place. Then there's a stealth test, and one of that's a test where you ask the company who's going to do the testing, and they know absolutely nothing about your company. So the only information that they can get is what they can find out in the public domain, out in the internet, under the who is for domain records, and try to find you and try to hack into your networks that way. So it's a very good thing to have done. If you don't do it every year, that's fine, but you should have it done every few years as just how secure is my network, so you know where your potential holes are and your potential vulnerability spots are. Also, I go through an audit questionnaire because every year when auditors come in, they have a list of questions, and I save those questions. So I review them ahead of time so that we know what the answers are and we can prepare, so by the time the auditors get in, we have double-checked things. And so questions that we get from auditors on a regular basis are things like, who has access to our physical equipment? Who has read and signed for your IT security policies? Who has access to your syslogs? Do you have an escrow agreement? That's a great item. A lot of times with software, you're wondering what happens if that software vendor goes out of business. So do you have an escrow agreement that secures your software rights if the company should ever go under? Intrusion detection. How's the company positioned to, again, stop hacking from coming into your network and taking sensitive data? One of the things the auditors have always asked me for is a list of our users. So give us a list, and in most cases it's using Active Directory, but who are the named users on your system and on your network, and are any of those employees no longer with the company, and are their logins and passwords still active, so that a departed or separated employee can still have access to your network. And when we're talking about NAV, one of the things we're talking about is the roles within NAV, because within NAV itself there are a lot of security issues, a lot of questions to be asked. So we always review that to make sure that it's current and it's appropriate. More challenges. So we review all our policies. At the end of the day, you have policies about security, about how you set up a new user, how we issue rights, even how we set up IP addresses or printers, or sets up desktops with antivirus. All of those policies are great to have. They have to be reviewed in a timely fashion, or they just sit there and collect dust. Email policies are very important. There's a lot of concerns going on with email, so it's important that you have an email policy, and things that you need to talk about with email are rules of usage. You need to let employees and people of your email system know, hey, these are things you can do with the email system. These are not appropriate things to do with the email system. It's important in today's world to also let them know about privacy. Corporate email is a corporate asset. It is not an individual asset. It's not an individual right of privacy. And people need to know that, so that there's no questions that, oh yes, we reviewed emails, we found emails that we have questions about or concerns about. So it's always important to have a policy that lets them know that email is a corporate asset, not a personal asset. Document retention and data retention. This is becoming a very big issue and a very hot topic. We need to make sure that your policies are up to date and that there are timelines. How long do we keep documents? How long do we keep data? There's no right or wrong there. There's just different policies that you need to set and you need to follow. And we need to validate that those are being followed. So if you decide that you're going to keep email for 3 years, we need to validate that after 3 years, those emails are going away. Now, if you say 5 years, it's 5 years. So the timeline just depends. But there's a lot of litigation issues going on today. There's a whole branch in the legal system called e-litigation and e-discovery. And these are items when a company has to go into litigation that the attorneys can ask for e-discovery, which means that they have access to all the documents ever produced on your network and all the documents that you have ever stored for historical purposes. So the validation and the consistency of these data retention policies becomes paramount, because if your policy is 3 years retention of, say, an email, and you go into litigation and someone comes up with an e-discovery request and you only have 11 months of email, there's a lot of potential risk there of why did you delete all this extra data? Where's all this extra data? Because you're not following a standard policy. Human resources becomes a big part of the review process. Do we have all our forms, and do we have our documents set out properly and everything organized? Do we have our procedures for this is what we do when someone new joins the company? We have an onboard process. We have paperwork to be filled out. So there's a lot of I's to dot, T's to cross. How do we validate things like security access, building access, network access, data access? And those generally fall under the human resource department. Same thing with separated employees. Employees will leave the company, they retire, different events will happen, and there should be steps and policies that say, this is what we do. Here's how we validated that, yes, we've turned off network access, their logins have been deactivated, emails have been forwarded on to someone else to take care of their business so that their emails just aren't collecting in a pile and not being answered. Keys have been collected if there's physical access to the buildings. A lot of different issues like that that human resources needs to validate these policies are still up to date and accurate. Use policies. These change all the time. Technology changes. New software comes into play at companies on a very regular basis. So to make sure our use policies, what is the appropriate use of a computer? What is the appropriate use of any corporate asset? And that way you know that everyone understands there's guidelines for what's the proper use of a corporate cell phone, of a corporate laptop, of any corporate equipment. Many times you have an employee handbook, and part of the HR process at the end of the year is to just go through it. Has anything changed? Does anything need to be added or deleted? So just a review process. Hardware and software inventory. This is something that always changes, and to make sure it's reasonably accurate. Are we checking things like warranty and life cycles on our equipment? What I would do every year is I look at these spreadsheets and reports that tell me, here's the life of when I put the equipment in, what's its life expectancy, what is my projection for needing to replace it. Cell phone contracts, something to be reviewed every year. It's a changing world. People who've been using cell phones for a long time know that you used to pay by the minute, then you had pooled minutes, then you had unlimited minutes, but you now have data usage contracts. Should you be pooling your cell phone contracts together, or should the contracts be individual and separate? How do you want to handle the purchase of new hardware for cell phones? Are those corporate assets, or are they individual assets with reimbursements? So different things to review, because that type of business, the cell phone contracts, changes so dramatically. It's really important to keep an eye on it. Replacement and upgrade costs. You may find that, hey, it's time to replace cell phones. We will do it on a regular basis to make sure we have current equipment and that we're not way behind the curve as far as technology goes with the cell phones. Disaster recovery and business continuity. This is a big item. Thinking of your network and thinking of the technology and thinking about how much computers and data is stored electronically in your business. What are you going to do in case something happens? Okay. What are you going to do if you lose your building or your data center crashes. So things to check: that you should have policies in place for this. You should have a procedure for doing disaster recovery and business continuity. And new questions to ask, again, changing technologies all the time. Should you do hosted backups? Should you do backups yourself? If you're doing backups, are we validating your backups? It's great to back up your data all the time, but if you never validate that you can retrieve information back, it may be of no value to you. There are many horror stories about people who've backed up their data, and then when the time comes they need it, they realize, whoops, whatever medium it was put on, whether it was tapes or disk to disk, that it's not valid on the other medium, and therefore it can't be retrieved. When you're talking about hosting, new things come into play today. We now have software as a service. We have infrastructure as a service. So as part of your disaster recovery and business continuity planning, should you have your own hardware and have a duplicate site, a backup site, or should you use a hosted solution and put an infrastructure in place as your backup for disaster recovery? Just things to put in your mind and questions to ask and challenges for yourself. If you do put in place a plan, which we highly recommend, you have some kind of plan for disaster recovery and business continuity, it's really important to review that, but also to test it. You need to take a time and a window and say, we're going to assume a disaster has happened, our data center's down, our building is gone. How do we test and validate that your disaster recovery plans work? Just like validating that your backups work, you need to validate that your disaster recovery plan is current, valid, and covers all the things that you want covered. Five-year projections. We spend a lot of time talking about where we will be in the future. What is the future? What does the future hold for us? And I always review a 5-year ongoing project that says, this is where I think we're going to be in 5 years. These are the things I think are going to be part of our business, and just to make sure you're on top of your situation. One of the things to look in when you're doing a 5-year projection, I built many of these in my time, and some people have not done 5-year strategic planning. Certainly that's something we'd be happy to help you with if that's something you want to look at. But I would look at, what is the business going to do? For me to make purchasing decisions, for me to make IT decisions and say, this is what I'm going to put from a resource into bandwidth, technology, and other things, I need to know what the business is going to be. Are we in acquisition mode? Are we in a selling mode where we're getting prepared to sell the business? Or are we just hunkering down and saying, look, times are tough and we're not going to make any changes? So therefore, that all determines things like, what are we going to do from a budget standpoint? And what are we going to do from a financial standpoint? Business projects, what do we have? What do we have coming up? Oh, we're opening up a new facility. We're opening up a new manufacturing plant. All sorts of things that have to be taken into consideration when you're looking at this. The mode to business, this is one that I think people really have to think about. You have to be part of a management team, and you have to ask these questions. Before we make investments in technology, before we make investments in equipment, what mode are we in? Are we in that hunker down mode? Are we in that, hey, we're getting ready to sell? Or are we in the acquisition growth mode? Those are things that really, to project 5 years out, you really have to have a visionary grasp. So think of it as a strategic level thinking, a visionary grasp of where's the business and where do we think it's going. Budgets are something I review every year. It's important to set out budgets, knowing where we're going to spend the dollars, knowing, with limited resources, which resources get what. Again, this goes back to also knowing what equipment do I replace, knowing what the life cycles are, knowing what our software is. Is our software meeting our current needs? Are we in a growth mode that requires us to change budgets? So I look at equipment replacement. What is the life cycle there? What are we going to end up needing? Insurance costs. Insurance premiums can be very high. So it's important that you look at your equipment lists, you look at your building, you look at all your assets, and each year you say, do I have enough insurance or do I have too much? Technology prices continue to drop at radical rates. I remember the first hard drive I ever purchased, which was a 100 meg hard drive. It cost $10,000. You know, today for $100 you buy multiple terabytes. So looking at your insurance replacement costs and knowing that they're in line so you're not underbuying or overbuying from your insurance. Bandwidth needs. Technology changes. You do more and more online. You may have users that say, hey, everyone used to work in the office. Now we have people working from home. Now we have people in remote offices. Now we have salespeople in the field trying to connect. Those all affect how much bandwidth you need to run your business. You're going to do more work in the cloud. That's going to require more bandwidth. So you need to know what your bandwidth needs are and what you think your future bandwidth needs are. New technologies. Always coming around. Always something new coming up. Cloud computing. That's a big new technology that's really reaching maturity and able to change the way you do business. Having business anywhere, any place, from any piece of equipment. Mobile computing, very popular, very strong growth, but new things coming on. Fax machines, I know for those of us who are older, fax machines, when they first came out, they were a game changer. It was a whole different world being able to just transmit a document in this way, then email, and now, of course, cloud computing, mobile computing, all those sorts of new technologies. You just need to stay on top, and are you going to leverage any of that technology to help you run your business? I always challenge people not to buy technology for technology's sake, but make sure it has some strategic value to the business to achieve your ultimate goals. When we get to budgeting, one of the things I like to do is I like to track what were one-time expenses versus my reoccurring expenses, and that allows us to say, this is what's going on, and this is things that we need to look at. So I created a slide here for you to look at, and this slide just is an example. So if you have 3 divisions in your company that you're budgeting for, we have so much access to data today that you can do visual representations of your budget numbers to get a feel for where the dollars are being spent. So in this case, either by percentage or by dollars, these are kind of our budgets on where we think we're spending money on different departments or divisions. This one I like, again, percentages and pure dollars, so you have a general idea that it's interesting to know that in our 77% of our budget is spent on reoccurring expenses. So those are the things we get to look at from a very tight detail and say, okay, are there ways to pare back some of those reoccurring expenses? The one-time expenses you may not have a choice in. You built a new building, or you had to bring in fiber for redundancy for your bandwidth. Those are things you might look at and say, well, those were a one-time expense. Once they're in place, shouldn't have to look at them for a very long time. So those, I may not have a lot of play in reducing those costs. But those recurring expenses, those are numbers you get to look at, and those are the ones you can negotiate and really look at trying to find a way to reduce those expenses. So when I break down my reoccurring expenses, I generally break them down into categories. Things like, okay, what do I pay for software? What am I paying for my licensing fees? Telephone systems and different telephony systems, bandwidth, is a huge number. Always set new contracts, always something new going on. You know, outside services. Am I using outside programmers? Am I using outside consultants? Different things like that will help us determine, hey, these are expenses we have. Now I can take each of these categories and say, what can I do? Let me look at the numbers. Let me look at these contracts. Let me look at the hardware. Let me look at it. Is this time to do cloud computing? Is this time to do mobile computing? In which case I might have even more hardware expense if I decide to go mobile computing, because if I do that, I can save more money in the administrative side of the business. So just having a look at that and having a visual representation helps me and would help you do your budgeting and know where those dollars are allocated. An IT philosophy. I found this very important in my years to have one, to say, where am I thinking from a mile-high view about technology? And so when I'm looking at purchasing new technology or when I'm looking at doing something for the business, I get to think about these strategies and I keep looking and say, okay, what do they follow any of these guidelines that we have? We want to be strategic in our purchasing and use of technology. We really want to maximize the value. I look all the time at how do I get the maximum value from this investment? Technology is a big investment. You really want to make sure you're getting as much out of it as you can. We want to standardize, streamlining your operations, being able to do a repeatable operation and make things as standard across the board will save you time, save you manpower, save you hours of work. And minimize, reducing our equipment. I would look every year to say, how can I reduce the hardware I use by 5% a year? How do I consolidate or reduce the number of vendors or software by, say, 5%? So things that came out, a good example was copy machines. At one point, you used to have a scanner, you used to have a fax machine, you used to have a copier in your office. They started consolidating all that equipment, and now you have these multi-function printers, and they're not only printers, but copy machines and fax machines and scanners. And by making these kind of purchases, you could eliminate 3 to 4 other pieces of equipment into a single piece of equipment. And so that way, you had a lot less to maintain, and you saved yourself money in the long run. So when we strategize, we look at hardware. You know, now today we have lots more options about should we own our hardware? Should we have it on-prem? Should we subscribe? Should this be a subscription service? Many people today are using the cloud. All your emails running through the cloud. So there are many things going through the cloud today. If you do online shopping, it's all cloud computing. So is it beneficial to you financially to own this equipment and keep it on-prem, or can you look at a subscription model? What's the replacement schedule of my hardware? If it's time to replace hardware, again, it's time to rethink it. Instead of just say, oh, time to replace it, let's buy new hardware and be done with it. Take that step back to say, well, is this a good time to revisit? Should we own it? Should we keep it? Should we try a SaaS model? Should we try cloud computing? And at least evaluate it. It may turn out not to be what you want to do, but take the time to evaluate it to make an informed decision. With software, you know, how do you want to upgrade your software? That is something that if you are using it to run your business, you know, how far behind or how old do you want your software to be? Software changes all the time. Many features that could help you and help your business will be available with new upgrades as the product's always being enhanced. So it's just time to think about it. If you think even your cell phones, they'll send you an update saying, hey, we have a new operating system update for your cell phone. And it could be to patch a security hole or fix a flaw. So those are things to look at. Does it make sense? Is it the right time? But give it a time to think about it and say, how are we going to do this not in a reactionary way, but a proactive way by strategically planning the process. New tools that are always available with software. Part of NAV 2015 has this fully integrated Zeta Docs with this drag and drop. You can replace file cabinets by using this feature. So not only allowing the upgrade to happen, but then actually leveraging the new features and some of the new tools that are available to you. So it's very important to take the time to think that through. On-prem versus hosted. Cloud computing is really coming to age. It's reaching a maturity point that it's something to think about when you're doing strategic planning. Again, this could be part of your disaster recovery or business continuity planning. If we host and we lose a building or we have a fire or something happens, what's the accessibility to my software to run my business and to my data? So it's a good time to rethink that. Mobile computing. It is, again, coming of age. The technology and the speeds that we're getting in cell technology and with tablets and phones and everything else, it's time to say, is it time to do mobile? Is it the right time? Does it have things to enhance your business? Will it make you more effective and more efficient? But when we get to mobile, now we have to deal with device management. How do we deal with these phones? How do you deal with your tablets? And how do we manage the process so, again, it's just not something sitting there collecting dust or becomes so outdated it can no longer interface or talk to your back systems. Bring your own versus company-supplied equipment. This is a debate that's been raging ever since BYOD became a topic for folks. Should employees be able to provide their own equipment because they're comfortable with it, and how will that fit into your network? Lots of different security issues there, liability issues, if the employee brings their own equipment in and there's viruses on it or there's inappropriate content on it, what do you do? If you supply the equipment as a company, how are you going to manage all that equipment? How are you going to manage updates? How are you going to make sure that they're getting all the patches and all the security fixes? So there's a lot of going back and forth. It used to be that some of the software dictated that the parameters and what you needed on that equipment were so specific that being company supplied was almost a given. In the world we work today, and again with the new mobile computing, cloud computing, software is no longer tied to hardware, and therefore it doesn't necessarily matter what piece of equipment you're on, just that you have access to a client or to a website or to a web page to do what you need to do. Standardize. There's a lot of savings to be found if we standardize on our networks. So when we think about things like standardizing equipment, you have servers that you can standardize across the board. At one time, I remember having over 100 servers, and by making sure they were all the exact same server, when it came time to patch them, to upgrade them, to swap memory, add memory, do different things to them, it became a very simple process. It was not complicated because everything was different. We had some continuity, so that made our time and expense to keep that equipment working much lower. Routers and switches. If you have multiple buildings, again, from a troubleshooting perspective and a network perspective, if you can say, hey, we're going to use this switch or this router, and this is what we're going to use as our standard, and we have multiple buildings, doing things like keeping them up to date, keeping the codes the same. And if there's an issue, a communication issue, it's much easier to troubleshoot these when we have some standard equipment across the board. Desktops, laptops, tablets, standardized, same thing. Knowing that we have the same kind of equipment makes troubleshooting easier. It makes training easier. So whether it's training the end user or training your IT staff or your external IT support staff, if they know they have, 2 or 3 pieces of equipment that they have to know versus 50, there's significant savings there. Printers and scanners, and I touched on this earlier. Being able to say, hey, in each building, in each area, we're going to use this printer, scanner, copier, fax, combo unit, and make them consistent, managing that equipment and lowering your costs of ownership and lowering the cost of maintenance. There's been many times I've been in people's buildings and they've got 20 different kinds of printers, and every printer has its own toner cartridge or inkjet cartridges. And then what happens is that printer goes away, it either breaks, it fails, it gets replaced, and next thing you know is you have a stockpile of unused toner cartridges or ink cartridges that have no use and can't be repurposed. So by standardizing across the board like that, we also save a lot of time that way and costs. Software. Standardizing on our software. How much software are we going to have? Where are we going to keep all that software? How many different versions of that software? So those are all important issues. When you talk about Microsoft Office, there may be Office 365. If you're trading documents with internal people, if someone has Office 95 and someone has Office 2010, or someone's using Office 365, those can cause some issues in compatibility, and it's one more thing to think about. So if you set some standards that say, we are going to be on this platform, we are all going to use the same product and the same version of the product, you really will make life much easier for everyone. You'll keep your costs down, you'll keep training costs down, and maintenance will just be a smaller issue. Same thing with some of the things you don't think too much about. Adobe Reader, just opening up a PDF file. There are hundreds of products to open PDF files. So whichever one you choose is great, but just be consistent across the board. Keep the troubleshooting and the number of balls in the air down to a minimum. With different contracts, review any contracts you have to see what you can do for standardization. When we get to minimize our users, what's the users we absolutely have to have? Do you have 100 users on your network with logins and passwords, but you only have 20 people using it? That happens a lot just over time. People come, new people do it, you change jobs, you change departments. This is where nav security takes a lot of time to think it through. If, we had someone working in AP, so they had all the security rights for accounts payable. Now we've moved them over to an order desk or a marketing role, and now they need a different set. Well, did we add the security on top of what they had before, so now they have more than they need, or did we create groups for users? Active Directory, keeping that up to date and really know that, yes, it's very clean. These are only the people we want in our network. It's very, very common that someone leaves the company and you never turn off their account, and so they still have access rights to your network, and it's just something to stay on top of. ERP, how many different systems do you have? What does it take to run your business, and which pieces does it take? Just something for you to think about to say, how do we control those processes? Office, whether it's a physical building, or office products, take a look at it. With more and more people having the ability to work remotely, do you need an office? I mean, maybe your office used to be 20,000 square feet, and you have most of your people working remotely today. Is the physical size of the building even something you need anymore? So just different things to keep in mind. Software support costs. Always reviewing contracts, looking at our costs of support. If you find you're paying support dollars for 3 different pieces of Word or word processing software, consolidate them. And let's say this is where we minimize and say, hey, we're not going to have 3 different ways of doing this. We're going to have one way of doing this and reduce our costs. Printing costs, reducing those. Do we need to print anymore? A lot of times people are printing out of habit. I've always printed this out, always put it in this book, always put it on this shelf. With new software, new updates, your ERP software, access to data has never been easier. And there are many times that you just don't need to print anymore. Now, there are times you do, in which case, how do you control your printing costs? If you're printing thousands of invoices a day, or even hundreds, and someone is standing there folding and stuffing envelopes, have you looked at pre-printed forms, self-sealing forms, that will dramatically reduce those costs? Postage costs. If you're sending out and mailing out invoices and statements, that can add up over the course of a year. Is it time to think about, hey, we're going to email these to people, or we're going to post them on our website and do an intranet or an extranet and say, have our customers come and get their information? It's a great time to review those kind of decisions to say, we'll build an extranet, or we'll start using EDI, or we'll find a way to electronically communicate with our customers and vendors so that we're not always putting things in the mail. Document storage costs. This is something that's always going down. The cost of storage continues to drop. It can still be expensive by the sheer dollars you're putting into it, but the costs are something to keep an eye on. Do I need to store these documents? Now, what's the cost if I store them electronically? So if you were to use, say, the ZetaDocs drag and drop version in Nav, and you store your with your vendor file, and you kept your W-9s, or you have your W-4s, or your 1099 documents and contracts and different things that you currently keep in a file cabinet. If you stored those electronically, what is the savings of being able to retrieve those while sitting at your desk instead of going to a file cabinet to find them? And if I have a room dedicated to nothing but banker boxes and file cabinets, what would be the savings in either manpower for constantly storing and replacing and moving if you kept that electronically? Just something to put in your mind, in the forefront, to say, we should review this and make the best decision possible. Document production costs. And this is where I talked about using self-forms, self-sealers, self-mailers. There's a lot of times I watch people fold and stuff envelopes and then run them through a postage machine. Well, if you do enough of that and the volume is there, you may find that if you're going to send things out through the physical mail, find a self-sealing form that you can print. It folds, it seals, no one's stuffing envelopes, and there's a lot of manpower to be saved. Next thing we want to talk about is social media. This is a huge impact on our society and our business today. So why should it concern you? Current social media, especially when they're talking about the X generation, Y generation, the millennials, 70% of all the purchases that are made today are based upon what the online reviews and social media say. So people are looking up different types of online reviews like Yelp, or they're talking to Facebook, or they're Twittering, and they're checking these things out. The younger generation business people have grown up with social media, and they actively use it. And they actively use it for a lot of decision-making processes. So it's very important to know, where do you stand from the social media side, what is being said about your company, and how much energy and time do you put into managing your social media accounts. The bad thing about social media, or the one negative in social media that you could say, is how rapidly a bad comment rolls through the system. And many times people are looking at reviews, or they're checking social media out. And you may have 100 very, very positive comments, and then you'll have a couple of very negative comments. And people have a tendency, by just human nature, to focus on those negative comments. And so those are the ones we really have to be careful about, and we have to monitor the social media so we know how to respond and how to respond appropriately. And so when we get to social media, what should you monitor? Well, there's so many out there, you have to know your business. What talks about business? Are we talking Facebook or Yelp or Twitter? Just as basic things to be checking. And what are they saying about you? And how are you going to respond? So then you have to decide, how do you respond and how do you monitor it? Are you going to have someone proactively looking at this every day? That's something you're going to check on a weekly basis. And how do you respond to comments? There's been studies done about how to respond. Should it be a positive message? Should it be a negative message? Do you put yourself up for just a back and forth contest with someone who's just unhappy? So give that some thought on which sites would affect your business and what's the best way to respond to any comments. At this point, we really want to thank everyone for being part of this presentation. And we really want to take some time here. We have some time left to answer any questions that might come up.
Great, thank you, James. We do have a few questions. Here's our first one. Why should we have an IT audit?
The reason for an IT audit is to really validate that what you're doing from an infrastructure and security is valid and works. So an IT audit will be double checking a lot of security and your vulnerability to hacking and the, just things like Target, which was big in the news. Verifying that you have your systems locked down, you don't have old software and holes that make your company vulnerable.
Okay, great. Our next question, what is the life cycle of computer hardware?
Hardware the life cycle for hardware will change depending on what it is. There's some standard rules of thumb to go by. They're not set in stone, so if you decide to extend the life, it doesn't make it a terrible thing. But laptops, generally considered to have a 3-year life cycle. They take a lot of abuse because everything's miniaturized. They generally look at 3 years. Servers, you can get a 5-year life cycle out of it. So those are guidelines to just say a desktop or a server, you might get up to 5 years out of. Now, sometimes you can take that equipment and put it somewhere else to gain some extra life out of it. And it doesn't mean that, when 3 years are up or 5 years are up, it's just going to fail and crash. But you have to look at the cost of parts and the cost of repair. And once that equipment gets those ages, it generally becomes more and more expensive the longer you hold on to technology to repair it.
Okay, our next question, is there a proper length of time to retain documents?
That's a question that's a yes and a no. Many documents have an IRS ruling about retention. And so the rule will be something like, this is a document and that you have to keep for 7 years or until you have an audit. Other documents are policies you get to set. So when we get to things like e-discovery that we talked about earlier, having a policy that says, hey, emails, we're going to set a rule, 3 years. You can make it 5 years, you can make it 1 year. You just have to be consistent. But there will be some documents that from an IRS ruling will have a very specific date that, these have to be kept, these are permanent records. One of the things you want to do when you think about document retention is to not keep things longer than you need to. I'll give you an example of the W-4 form that employees fill out. I believe that that has a lifespan of 3 years. And when you get an audit from the IRS, they will look at those documents to see if they've been filled out properly. Well, if you've kept 15 years of those documents, they actually have the right, even though 3 years is the window, they have the right to go back all 15 years. So if you've kept it, it is open for them to look at. And if they find a problem, even though it was 7 or 8 years ago, they still have the right to write you up for it. So don't keep things longer than necessary, but follow the guidelines for document retention, either the ones set by the IRS or the ones you set internally, and make sure you follow those.
Our final question this morning, James, what steps should we take to start a disaster recovery or business continuity program?
Very important that a lot of companies don't put into practice. The way to start that is to review what your needs are, what can you live with, what do you need to operate your business and keep your business functioning if something disastrous were to happen. If you lost your building, if you had a fire, what are the critical issues? So identifying the critical issues of what it takes to keep your business running. We are certainly happy to help you in that process. We can go through all the different steps of disaster recovery planning and business continuity. It will change with each person's business. Are you a business that needs to be up and running 24/7? Are you required to be connected to the internet and to other systems within 5 minutes? How much downtime can you afford to have? There are some businesses that you said, oh, I can't do any billing for 30 days, not the end of the world. In other cases, wait a minute, I can't send a quote out in 5 minutes. That's a big problem. So each company has to look at that, and it's a process. But what is your critical needs? What are your critical functions that keep the business running? And there's a lot of miscellaneous things going on in your business that you probably can, again, categorize and say, you know what, I can go 30 days without that. But what is the core mission critical items? Those are the things you have to identify first and foremost so you can develop a plan.
Great. Well, James, we want to thank you for your presentation today. I know that was a lot of critical information. In case you didn't catch it all, or if you want to have someone else in your organization view this presentation, we do record all of our webinars here at ABC. This one will be up on the website by this afternoon, and the website address is abc-computers.com. So we want to thank everyone for attending today, and thank you, James, for the presentation.
Well, thank you, and I thank everyone for attending. I know it was a lot of information in a very short time, so please feel free to review it or feel free to contact us if you have questions or any comments. Thank you very much.